Hey everyone, my name's Arjun, and today I'm going to be showing you guys 12 dynamic opening traps. So before we get started, I just wanted to let you guys know something. And there are a lot of opening traps, such as the Lasker's Trap, the Legal's Trap, and lots of others like that. But the only thing that I have against these traps is that they rarely ever come up in games. And this is usually because they're so well known that most people will know how to avoid them. So today, the 12 opening traps I'm going to show are traps that are much more likely to actually come up in your games. And with that out of the way, let's get on to the first trap. So this trap occurs in the London system, and it begins like this. D4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop f4. And this marks the beginning of the London system. So the London doesn't necessarily need to come up from this move order. It can also come up where black has played d5 at the beginning. And generally some common plans for both sides include white will play e3, bishop d3, knight d2, and c3. And meanwhile, black will most likely play d5, c5, bishop to e7 or to d6, and his knight most likely to c6 or to d7. And for this trap to occur, black will have to play c5. And this isn't a bad move or anything, but white will play e3 here. And the idea is that if black takes, white will take back with the pawn. And white's also going to play bishop d3 if he's allowed to. So black plays b6 here, just intending to fianchetto the bishop. And here, normally white could play bishop d3, which is a perfectly fine move. But in order to set this trap, white should play knight to d2. And here black plays bishop to b7, just natural, developing the bishop. He's not worse or anything yet, but if he messes up on the next move, then he definitely will be. So white plays knight to c4. And this is a very cunning move here because it makes a threat on d6, and it's actually very difficult to see that ahead of time, especially in blitz games. So the most obvious way of stopping this knight to d6 threat is to play d5, and this falls into the trap. But some other options include to play d6, and if this happens, white should just take on c5. Then if black takes back, white should just trade queens, and he's a bit better. He's not winning or anything, but he does have some advantage after, say, knight to c to e5. And of course, in this position, if he takes with the b pawn, then you can take on d6, just winning a pawn. So d6 isn't a very good move. And the best move here is actually just to play knight c6, ignoring the threat. So if white tries to play knight d6, black will recapture, takes, and he'll play knight e4, kicking the bishop back. Black will castle, and it's about equal. But all these moves are good, but we're focusing on the trap here. So instead, black might play d5, and this falls into the trap. White should play knight c to e5, which actually creates two hard-to-see threats. And one of them is bishop to b5. The other is knight to g5. So if black just plays a random move, let's say h6, white will play bishop to b5. And the idea is that if black plays knight to c6, you can take, and you'll win an exchange. And you're already up a piece, actually. But anyway. If black plays either knight to d7, white will take, black will take back, and white will play knight to e5. And this is winning. So black won't play h6. If he plays a6, however, trying to stop the bishop b5 threat, he should play knight to g5. And this just double attacks f7, and there's actually no good way of stopping that. If black plays something like queen to e7, for example, then white can just take. So therefore, you might think there's no way to stop both threats. But black's best try is probably to play something like knight to d7. And after knight d7, white should play bishop b5, threatening to play, if black just does nothing, the same idea as before. So black is probably going to play a6 here, because it prevents white from taking on d7, at least without losing this bishop. And now here, white actually has only one move of retaining his advantage, and that's to play knight g5, which is a very powerful move. So black should obviously just take on b5. That was his intention. He should just follow through with that. And now white should take on f7. This attacks the queen and the rook, which is a fork. So black should probably play something like queen e7, protecting his queen. Now white will take on h8. And if white's knight is able to get back somehow, for example like that, then he'll be up in exchange and he should be much better or winning. But obviously black isn't going to let white do that. So black might try h6, trying to cut off the knight's lifeline. But in this case, white can play knight to g6, and if queen d8, knight f3. and this knight will escape to e5 probably next. So h6 is not a good move because it undefends this crucial g6 square. So another option to try and get rid of this g5 lifeline is for black to play knight e4. But after knight e4, what white can play is he can just go queen h5. And the idea is that if g6, then white can take on h7. So if knight takes here, then white should just take on g6. If knight f7, this is the only way of protecting the knight, white can play bishop g5, which is another cool tactic. And of course, if black takes here, white can just take. And here, another tactic actually, he'll take on f8. And here, knight f7, winning the queen next move. So after king e7, then knight takes g5. So that's one pretty long line. So anyway, so white's going to play queen, or not knight f7, he's going to play queen to h5. So after g6 again, queen h7, and if black takes to the queen, you can just take here, and the knight will capture on g6 after pretty much any move by black actually. If he take castles, you can just take. So that's how you refute knight e4. And there's only one more real good option for black, and that's to play just some nothing move. And one example of that would be rook a7. And the easiest way of winning this position is to just play knight takes h7, which is another tactic within this one tactic. And the concept is, if black takes, you can play queen to h5 check. And of course, if king d8, then you can just take this pawn, this knight. And if you play something like g6, white should just take, king over, knight f7. And the idea is that once black's king moves, you can just take this knight for free. And the only other real try black has, once he reaches this position, is to play e5. And after e5, white should just take, most likely. Black should obviously take back. There's no other reasonable move. And now the easiest is to play knight h7. And of course, if black doesn't take, then this g6 lifeline is once again available. And if he does recapture, white can just play queen h5. And this is another fork. Actually, a triple fork, technically. So whatever black does here, if he plays like this, for example, white should just take the knight. And he's recaptured his piece, and his knight will escape soon. So that is this London trap, and this is probably my favorite trap out of all of these. And it's also probably my favorite trap in general, actually. So this next trap occurs from the Sicilian Defense, which is a very popular opening. So it's for white, again, and it starts as e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. So the open Sicilian. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and d6. So this is the best move, but this does not fall into the trap. So if black plays the move g6, then he's already fallen into the trap. He's not losing, but he is slightly worse. And the idea that white has is he's going to take on c6. So black could take with the d-pawn, but that wasn't his point, because you can just take back and play something like bishop c4. And white's a bit better because he's ahead in development and black can't castle. But most people would play b takes c6. And white's going to play e5, just attacking this knight. And the knight has three possible options. Knight g8 is clearly not good because it just retreats to the knight's starting square. White should just continue development here. Knight h5 is also not a good move because it puts the knight on the side, and white is obviously better here. And he can play something like bishop c4. And the last move is to play knight d5, which is actually the worst of the three moves. So white plays knight takes d5, c takes d5, queen d5, and once black plays rook b8, he might have seen all of this. And the idea that black has is that this bishop right here, it's tied to this b2 pawn. This bishop is tied to this g2 pawn if black ends up playing bishop to b7. And black's also going to develop to g7, and then he'll castle. And it seems like black's position is pretty good here. It seems like the position should be about equal, because black clearly has a lot of counterplay, even though he is down a pawn. But here white has a killer move, which is e6. And this is actually very difficult to spot from pretty far away, especially in the opening. So if black takes with either pawn, actually, white should play queen e5, and this forks both rooks. So if black plays something like queen d6 to try to protect one rook, white will just take the other one. So if black doesn't recapture on d6, well, obviously if he plays d6, then he'll just take on f7. White's much better. And if he plays f6, then the idea is that white can just play something like bishop f4. And if black tries taking the rook, taking this pawn, white has this really cool move, castles queenside. And I just really like this move because it's castling and it's attacking this pawn, which is pretty cool. So if black tries to play something like, for example, rook b7, then white can just play bishop a6. And once black's rook moves away, you can just take on c8 and take on d7, and white is completely winning. So the third trap I have to show today is also coming from the Sicilian Defense. And it's in the dragon, specifically the Levenfish variation. So it starts with e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. And this begins the dragon variation. So the most popular move here is to play bishop e3. And white's idea is he'll play f3, queen d2, castles queenside. The bishop will probably go to c4, and he'll play f4, h4, and g4, and he'll try to attack on the king side. But to set this trap, white can't play this line. So instead, he plays the move f4, which is a very powerful move that can easily win games very quickly. So black might play bishop g7, which is a natural move, and here white should play e5. So if black takes here, he takes, and now black only has one move which retains relative equality, and that is to play knight f to d7. However, this move isn't very appealing to black players here because you can play e6, and the idea is that if you move your knight back somewhere, then you can take on f7. And if you take with the knight, then you've got this isolated e-pawn. And of course, if you take with the king, then you have the isolated e-pawn, and you also can't castle. So most people won't play knight d7, and there's two other options. There's actually three other options. There is knight to h5, but this is also not a good move. So what white wants to do is he wants to play g4, trapping the knight. But the problem is black can play bishop e5. So to make this move even better, white should play bishop to b5 check before that. And the idea is that no matter which piece black blocks with, the knight or the bishop, let's say he blocks with the bishop, white should play g4 now. And the idea is now bishop takes e5 here is kind of pointless because you can just take on h5 and the d4 knight is not hanging. If black tries to take on b5 here, you can just take with actually either knight. It doesn't really matter. And you're up a piece. So black should play something like, for example, queen to c7. After which white can just play knight f3, protecting this pawn, and then he'll take this knight next move. So that is how you refute knight h5. And there's two other options, knight g4 and knight to d5. So if he plays knight to g4, the idea is that white can play bishop b5, and there's no good moves for black here. If he plays knight to c6, you can take. If he takes, you can take, and you're going to win some material. If he blocks with either piece on g7, you can just take this knight. If he blocks with the bishop, the same thing. And if he plays king f8, then white has an even better move, which is to play knight e6. And no matter which way black takes, white will take on d8, and he wins the queen, and in this case also is checkmate. So what black should do is he should just play something like this, after which white can just take the queen. So knight g4 also doesn't work, and he has one last remaining try. If he plays something like knight to d5, white will play bishop b5, as he's been doing in some other variations. And of course, if you block on d7 with either piece, you can win this knight. And it's the same story if you block with this knight, because you can just take. If you play knight to c6, then you can just go with the same fork mechanism I showed earlier, where you will win this rook next move. So the only other option remaining for black is for him to castle. So what white should do now is he should play castles here. And the idea is that now that his rook is on the same line as black's king, he has a lot of mating and forking opportunities. So just one example here is if black plays something like knight to c6, then white can play queen f3, and that just forks the knight and the f7 pawn. So what black should do is he should just take on e5, and he should just be down a piece. And that's just one example of what can happen if he's not careful. The next trap I have to show also comes from the Sicilian Defense, but this time it comes from the Allopin Variation. So it starts off with e4, c5, knight f3, g6, c3. And the idea is white wants to play d4 and build a big center. So black just plays knight c6, natural move, d4. And here, the most common moves are for black to play c takes d4 and knight f6. But since this is a trap, black plays an inferior move, which is bishop to g4. And it seems very natural. It seems as though black is just going to pin this knight, and therefore indirectly putting pressure on d4. However, white has a very strong move here, and that's a d5. So this doesn't look like a super special move at first, but it actually gets a very good position. If black plays knight to e5, white will actually just take. And of course, if you take back on e5, then queen takes g4. And if bishop takes d1, then bishop b5 check. And he's forced to block with the queen, after which you can take king d8. You can take on f7, king here, and just take on d1, followed by capturing on h8, after which white's up a lot of material. So if he doesn't play knight e5, he only has two other reasonable options, and those are to go knight a5 and knight b8. So if he plays knight to a5, white should just play b4, and this actually just traps the knight straight away. So if you take, white will take back, and if black moves his knight anywhere, you can just take it. And even if he doesn't move his knight, you can just take it next move. So knight a5 is clearly bad, and the only other option is to play knight b8, and it's never a good sign when retreating your knight to b8 is the best move. And what white should do from here is he should just develop his pieces, and when black brings his piece back, you can just develop your other pieces. And white's ahead a bit in development, and he has a better position. So trap number 5 occurs in the Queen's Gambit Accepted, which is not a very popular opening. The Queen's Gambit Declined is more popular, but this opening still does happen quite often. So d4, d5. In this case, white plays knight f3, knight f6. It doesn't really matter, and he plays c4 now. So c4, d takes c4, and he plays e3, just trying to recapture this piece. Black plays g6, white takes, black just develops his bishop, and white checks here. So this isn't the best move. Instead, what white should do is he should probably just castle, although he's not worse or anything after queen to a4. So here black has several options as to how he can stop the check. He can play c6, knight c6, knight d7, bishop d7, or queen d7. Those are the main reasonable options. And actually, out of those, only one of them survives, and that is the move c6, after which the position is about equal. So let's go over the other options. If black plays knight to c6, then white can play knight e5, which is a double attack. It forks c6 and f7. And what black should do here is he should just castle, after which you can take, and here white should just continue developing instead of capturing the pawn by, say, castles. So instead of playing knight to c6, black can play knight to d7. And this is actually a much worse move because white has this move bishop f7. So black could take on f7, but the problem with this is he'll play knight to g5. And from here, if king to g8 is played, then you can play queen b3. And if you block, you can capture, the king moves, and queen f7 checkmate. After king f8 or king e8, the move is the same. White will play knight to e6. And if king f8, then this just forks the queen and king, so white wins a queen. And if king e8, then knight e6 actually just traps the queen, so the queen can't escape. So the best move in this position is for black to play king f8, but after this, white can just bring his bishop back, and the king can't castle, it's very weak, and white has just won a pawn, which is great. So if black tries playing, instead of knight c6 or knight d7, instead if he plays bishop to d7, what white can do is he can play queen to b3, which is another fork. And if black castles, which is the best move, white will just take on b7. And if he protects b7 by playing, say, b6, you can take on f7. So the only other option remaining to black is to play queen to d7, after which white will play bishop takes f7. So if black takes on f7, this is a really bad move because knight e5, and no matter where the king moves, black will take on d7, white will take on d7, winning the queen. So the best move after bishop takes f7 is to play king f8. And white should just retreat his queen somewhere, maybe to c2 or to d1. And the bishop is still immune because of knight e5. And just a note, if he plays knight f to d7, which is very unlikely, white can just do the exact same thing that he did if knight b to d7 was played. He can take on an f7. If king takes, then knight to g5. And here black should play king f6, trying to avoid what happened there. And although he is down material, black's king is incredibly weak, and he should be able to mate him quite soon. So this next trap is called the Marshall Trap, and it occurs from the Petrov defense. And this one is for black. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and this is the Petrov defense. So white plays knight takes e5, black plays d6, knight f3, knight takes e4. So white plays d4, then black might play d5. So then bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, castles. These are all very natural moves. And in order to play the Marshall Trap, the play must continue like this. White plays c4, which is the most common move, and then bishop g4. And this move initiates the Marshall Trap. So the best move here is to play something like c6, where the position's about equal. But instead, black plays bishop g4, which is a slight inaccuracy, but it sets a deadly trap. So white is going to take this pawn, which is very natural, and black plays f5. And the main idea of playing f5 is just to protect this pawn, and also it activates this rook. And it's also just generally an aggressive move. So white should play a move like knight b to d2, and black can't really use the trap here. But if white plays the very natural move, rook to e1, then he's already fallen into the trap. And this trap here goes bishop takes h2. And what white should do here is he should play king f1, which protects his pawn, and black's a bit better, but he's not winning or anything. But the most natural move is to play king takes h2, after which black will take on f2. And it doesn't really matter where white's queen moves here. Any square will do. But let's say he goes queen to e2. Then knight takes d3, queen takes d3, forced, and bishop f3. And here the trap might start to make sense here, because if you capture with either the queen or the pawn, queen h4 forks the rook, and you can win the rook. So white shouldn't take the piece, and if you play something like king g1 trying to escape this fork, then white can either just attack the rook or bring his bishop back like this. And he's somewhat better here. So the seventh trap is called the Rubinstein Trap. And this trap is especially useful for faster time controls. So this trap is played for black and starts with e4, c5, d4, c takes d4, c3, d takes c3, knight c3. And this is the Smith-Morra Gambit. So knight c6, knight f3, e6, bishop c4, queen c7, castles, knight f6. So this is all normal so far. White plays queen e2, and this is a theme that occurs in many different openings. And it's that black plays knight to g4, which is a good move on its own, even if it didn't set a trap. And here, what black's idea is he's threatening h2, just playing aggressively, and he's also threatening to play knight d4 which sets a pretty cool trap. So what white should do is he should play something like knight b5, which stops the trap and attacks the queen. But to fall into the trap, you can play anything, and one of these moves is to play h3. And the reason this falls into the trap is because black will play knight d4. So if white takes the knight, then black can play queen h2, checkmate. If black just moves his queen somewhere, what black should do is he should just take, and if white takes back, then queen h2, checkmate. And of course, if he tries to stop the mate by taking here, for example, black should just take on e2. And he's won the queen and should win the game pretty easily. This next trap is also one of my favorite traps out of these because it's actually very easy to miss. So this occurs in the Scandinavian, which is e4, d5. So takes, knight c3, queen d8. So this isn't a very popular move in the Scandinavian. More common moves include queen e5, queen d6, and queen a5. But this line still does show up every now and then. So white plays knight f3, black plays knight f6, white plays bishop g4, white plays bishop c4, black plays bishop g4. And although black has been playing very natural moves, black is completely lost in this position. And the reason for that is because white plays knight e5. So this is actually kind of a similar theme to the Legal's trap, which you may know, where white plays a move that looks like it hangs its queen, but it really creates a double attack on f7. So black has a few options. Of course, if he takes the queen, then bishop f7 is checkmate. If he tries protecting the f7 pawn, white can just sack his queen. And if you take back, then checkmate. So the best move is to play bishop e6. But the problem with this is white can just take and castle, after which he's much better or winning, because black has very bad pawns, white has an active knight, and he has better development. So there's only really one other option. Of course, if black plays something like e6, just trying to protect this pawn, white can take on g4, and he's up a piece. So black's last attempt is to play like queen d4. And the easiest way of winning this position, in my opinion, is to just take on f7. Black should play king to d8, and knight takes g4. It doesn't matter which way black takes. If he takes with the queen, you can just trade queens. And white can play something like bishop e6 or just d4, continuing development. And in this position, he's up a pawn. He has more active pieces and better development. And not to mention that black can't castle. So yeah, that's this trap. And here is the 9th trap. And this one occurs in the Caro-Kann Defense, which is an opening I actually play. So it starts as e4, c6, knight c3, and the most common move is to play d4 here. But white is going to intend to play the two knights. So d5, knight f3. So this begins the two knights variation of the Caro-Kann. So black plays d takes e4, which isn't the best move. It's not bad, really, but it's not the best. And bishop g4 here is the main line. So if black plays d takes e4, then knight takes e4, and black should play something like knight f6, but instead he plays bishop f5, which is very similar to the classical Caro-Kann. So if he plays knight g3, bishop g6, and this looks very similar to a position in the classical Caro-Kann, which I can show you right now. So the classical Caro-Kann goes like this. So if you look at this position and this position, you'll notice there's only one difference, really. And it's that in this position, white's pawn is on d4. But in this position, white's pawn isn't on d4, but it's his turn. So if white were to play d4 here, then these two positions would actually be the exact same. But since white hasn't played d4, he can utilize his extra tempo and play a very powerful move. He can play the move h4. And this is another common idea in the classical Caro-Kann, but it's even stronger here, trying to trap the bishop. So black will probably play h6, just making room for his bishop. And here, white should play knight to e5. And this is trying to force the bishop to h7. So black shouldn't actually play his bishop to h7. He should play a move like queen d6. But if you take, white's not winning, but he has a better position because he has the two bishops, and he just has an easy game in general. So instead, black will probably play bishop h7. And here, white should play queen to h5, which is threatening checkmate on f7. So black should play g6 here, just stopping the mate, after which white will play bishop to c4. And this isn't the best move. The best move is to play queen f3, but in my opinion, this move is definitely easier to play. So bishop c4, then black plays e6, just stopping the mate threat, and queen to e2. This creates another trap threat, and the idea is that if black just continues developing, then you can play knight f7. And if he takes, you can take here with checkmate. But even if black sees that threat, and if he plays a move that stops the threat, such as, for example, queen to e7, then white should just continue developing, and he is better here. You can play something like a4, stopping these b5 ideas and also gaining space. Black can play something like knight f6, or not c3, sorry, b3. White can play b3, continuing development, and white has a solid and comfortable position. Trap number 10 occurs in the Dutch defense, and this is probably my least favorite trap out of all of these, but it still can occur. d4, f5, and the best move here is to play c4, and it's also one of the most common. And white's plans are just to play something like knight c3, probably g3, bishop g2, etc. But instead, white plays bishop to g5. And after black's next move, you might see why I don't like this trap as much as the others. And it's because black will play h6, just attacking the bishop, bishop h4, and in blitz and bullet games, black might play g5, which is actually a really bad move here. And he might think that after bishop g3, he's trapping your bishop on g3. And in most openings, pretty much every opening except really the Dutch, this would be true, and white would be pretty much losing. But in this opening, white can play e3. And the idea is that he's threatening queen h5 mate. So black takes the bishop, that's mate. So if black just tries stopping the mate by knight f6, you can take on f4, and you're up a pawn with a good position, because black's king is pretty weak. That is not weak, this is weak. So instead of playing knight to f6, black might try h5. And the idea behind this is if you take, then he can try h4, trapping your bishop again. But what you should do here is you should play bishop to e2. And the idea behind this move is you can take on h5 next. And if he tries to take your bishop once again, you can take, followed by mate. And if he tries to play knight f6, intending to protect the pawn and then go about his plan, you can take on f4. And if he plays h4, just trying to trap your bishop once again, you can take on g5. Then if he takes here, now since his knight was on f6, you can take on f6. And if black takes here, then you should just play bishop h5 and try to draw the king out. So if black takes on f2 instead, you can just take on f2. If he takes back, then you can just start trying to mate him. And white is winning here. So this trap is another trap for black, and this occurs in the French defense, specifically the Fort Knox variation. Or actually, this trap doesn't occur for black. Whoops. So it starts as e4, e6, d4, d5. This is the French defense. Knight c3. So this is the main line, basically. And the most common moves for black are to play knight f6 and bishop b4. But instead, black plays g takes e4, which is less common, but it's not really bad. So white takes, and black plays bishop to d7. And the idea is that if black continues development like he does if white continues developing like he does in the game, Then black will play bishop to c6, and the idea is he wants to trade off this light squared bishop, which is generally the bad bishop in the French, and he wants to exchange it for this knight on e4, which is pretty good. So this is what happens in the trap. White plays bishop d3, and black should take on e4 here, following through with his plan. But instead he plays knight f6, which is already a bad move, and it seems very natural, which makes it kind of surprising. So white takes on f6, and black has two options here. He can take with the pawn, or if he wants to, he can take with the queen, which is a very bad move. So if he takes with the queen, then white should play bishop g5. And you might think here that this is a blunder, because although it does look like it traps the queen, black can play bishop f3. And if you recapture, you can just take on g5. But once you're in this position, white can play a really strong move, queen to d2. And this continues the trap on the queen because white has protected his bishop, but the queen has no other squares to go to. So this sort of motif can occur in many different openings, not just the French. So if black does pretty much anything, white will take. And if black tries to take on d4 with his queen, then white has a discovered attack, which is bishop b5. So if you just moved your queen back, then you can take. And if you play knight c6, then the knight's pinned, so you can just take on d4. So the final trap occurs in the Ruy Lopez, and this one is for black as well. So it starts as e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop b5, knight f6. And this is the Berlin defense, which is very popular. So white plays d3, which is not the most common move. The most common move is to play castles, but he plays d3. And here, the best move is probably to play bishop c5. But in this trap, white plays knight c to e7. And this is actually like a common line, not super common, not as common as bishop c5, but it's not like a bad move or anything. It's not the best, but it still works. And the trap is if white plays knight takes e5. And it might seem obvious that white might realize that black is setting a trap, but actually, even if he spends a bit of time here, it's not super easy to see black's next idea. So if white does play knight takes e5, then black can play c6, winning a piece. And the idea is that if white just moves his piece, then you can play queen a5. And no matter what white does, you can take on e5 next move. So white has one idea left to try to save his piece, and that's to play knight c4. And that's threatening a smothered mate on d6. So this would be a blunder because of knight to d6. So instead, black can play very simple chess here. He can just play knight to g6, protecting this mate because of the bishop. And once white moves his bishop back, black can play b5. And this is a pawn fork because it's attacking these two pieces. If he moves the knight, black will take the bishop. And if he moves the bishop, black will take the knight. So those are my 12 opening traps for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope these can come up in your games at some point. Thank you for watching.